Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the RacingNews365.com Formula One podcast. My name is Michael Butterworth and I'm joined as ever by Dieter Renken, editorial director of Racing News 365. Dieter, as ever, welcome along to the show. I know you've done a lot of travelling lately and you're a bit thick with sleep because you're in the Middle East this morning.
Absolutely. I'm here on some non-editorial business. You caught me very, very early in the morning after a late flight last night. But yes, absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I know that you're very busy and you weren't able to be at the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka, but you followed it along with the rest of us. It was a race full of suspense and intrigue and controversy, and there's several talking points which we will come to. But the first place to start, the only place to start, I think, is by talking about Max Verstappen, who we now know is the 2022 Formula One World Champion. I feel like we've ignored Verstappen a little bit in some of the recent podcasts because he's won so dominantly and it's been so obvious for such a long time that he's going to be the 2022 champion. But let's talk about that now because it was a typically dominant performance, his 12th win of 18 races so far in 2022. We only had 28 laps of racing because there was that big rain delay, and we'll come on to talking about that shortly. But after 28 laps, he was 26 seconds ahead. And I thought this performance really just epitomized the level of dominance that we've seen from Verstappen and from Red Bull, especially in these last few races.
Absolutely. I mean, it was just a superb, stellar performance by Max. And just going back to your statistic about winning 12 from 18, I think we should accept that the first two races he didn't win as a result of car issues. And, accordingly, we have a situation here where, Max has actually won 12 of the 16 races where it was within his gift to win them, which is an absolutely superb performance. I mean, 75% are the sort of numbers that one used to associate with people like Jim Clark, etc., back in the 60s. So an absolutely superb performance by both Max, the team, and also, it must be said, Sergio Checo Perez in a sort of support role. I know that the Mexican would love to be at the sharp end himself, but I think he sort of accepted that his role now is actually to play a support role for Max, and he does that absolutely superbly. Takes the points off the opposition when he needs to.
And talking about Checo, the two wins that he's got this year were when Verstappen had a couple of his rare off days. In Monaco, he wasn't quite on the pace. In Singapore, he had that mistake and finished down the order in 7th. And I think Checo has come closer to Max than any teammate that he has had since Daniel Ricciardo, who was fairly evenly matched with him in 17 and 18.
Absolutely. I mean, Checo really, I think, is at the peak of his game. The interesting thing is if you have a look at Monaco, if you look at Singapore, very similar in that they're both street circuits. And if we also look at some of his other performances, they are where the driver has had to really manage his car and the rubber. For example, yesterday. And, Checo had this nickname, the Tyre Whisperer. And I think that has really stood him in good stead this season.
I've just remembered, talking about street circuits, he was also on pole in Saudi and he might have won there, but he got he fell foul of a very unfortunately timed safety car.
Correct, absolutely. I think that he's becoming increasingly Formula One street fighting man.
Well, Verstappen was crowned world champion after the race, but there was some confusion. We had to wait after the race. Verstappen himself didn't even know that he was world champion until he was sort of in the middle of his post-race interviews. There was some confusion over the awarding of full points. As I mentioned just now, this race, it was red flagged after 2 laps because there was some accidents, and we'll come on to talking about that because there's some very serious issues that emerged there. But it was red flagged. We had a break of about 2 hours before we finally went racing again. We got 28 laps in about roughly 40 minutes of action before the clock hit the time limit. But there was some confusion over the awarding of full points because we've had, you remember that race in Spa last year, we only had 2 laps, and should it have counted, should it not have counted? And there was a rule change this year. So we have a sliding scale of points now with relevance to how much of the race has been completed. What nobody seemed to take into account was the regulations for the sliding scale of points only count if the race is halted and then doesn't restart. Whereas because this was halted and then it restarted, they therefore carried full points. And so Verstappen got the 25 points for the win, because of then a penalty for Charles Leclerc, who was dropped from second to third. That meant that he was world champion. And we had this farcical situation where halfway through his interview, he was being told that he was world champion.
Yeah, I mean, this again is an example of the sort of unintended consequences we have whenever there's a rule change, where they haven't been thought through properly, where somebody comes along and says, this is wrong, we need to change that, let's do this, and everybody says, yes, 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 and they do that. And then, of course, at some stage in the very near future, we have a situation which is similar, but not quite the same, and then we end up with what, again, one of these anomalies. And I really think it is time that Formula One collectively, and I stress this collectively because the rules-making process is a collective process. It's not the FIA. It's very easy for people to chuck stones at the FIA non-stop and say, the FIA this and the FIA that. The rule changes last year after Spa were voted through on a co-op basis between all 10 teams, Formula One, and the FIA. The FIA's job is to regulate the sport. It is not actually to make the rules, because that's the way that the Concord Agreement, the various covenants are structured. And again, here we have an example of a collective process, far too many compromises being made. If we do this, then it affects that team, and if we do that, it affects the other team, and then ultimately we end up with compromised regulations. And this, again, yesterday was another example. I spoke to a team boss on the telephone after the race, and he sort of chuckled and said, the silly thing is that we team bosses didn't even know our own regulations. And, many a true word is said in jest, but absolutely.
Well, does that not raise the point that if the teams, if the drivers, I mean, the commentators were seemingly thinking that we were going to have the sliding scale applied as well. If nobody knows what the regulations are, does that not show that the regulations need to be written or need to be worded more clearly?
Absolutely. As I say, they should look at the entire rule book from beginning to end. I believe that they were looking at this for this season, potentially for next season, depending on how long it took. And then again, the team said, but we have a problem because, we've got these new 2022 regulations and we've still got to work our way through those. So let's delay it for another year or two. And I believe that they now decided to put this whole process on ice until 26, which means that potentially we either have this hodgepodge rule situation through until the end of 25, or again, it's going to be rushed through with the sort of required majorities, which requires compromises, etc. In fact, the team boss I spoke to yesterday was absolutely adamant that it's about time that the regulatory process from beginning to end was handed over to the FIA. It's their championship. It's called the FIA Formula One World Championship. And as far as he's concerned, the FIA should run the sport. And if the teams want to come and play in the FIA's championship, they're more than welcome. If they don't want to, let them go and play in IndyCar or wherever else. And I couldn't agree more with that sort of philosophy. Yes, it is a pretty harsh philosophy, but ultimately I think that will benefit the sport in the longer term, and that's the crucial point.
Yeah, and with the regulations, the way they're written for this year, you could conceivably have a situation where a race is stopped after 2 laps, like this one was at Suzuka, and then if it's restarted over, say, another 2 or 3 laps or whatever, you have a 5-lap race that would carry full points. Yeah. Yet, if the race starts and is stopped after, say, 30 laps, and then it doesn't qualify for full points, so which seems to, it feels like that needs to be rethought and rewritten.
Michael, as an illustration of exactly how complex and convoluted the rule book is, during the course of the weekend, the race director saw fit to issue a clarification which reads, for the purposes of Article 30.5N of the sporting regulations, the start will therefore occur when the leading car crosses the control line. In reference to Article 51.1, the stewards have advised that they will consider the word should not to mean must. And again, the fact that one has to issue these sort of clarifications just points to a very, very complicated rule book. And I think Formula One is just far too complicated for its own good.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Abu Dhabi debacle from last year when any does not mean all, and all the teams trying to find ways around the particular wording of the particular regulations.
Correct, absolutely. And, again, this is because the rule books have evolved over a period of 70 years, and they've just kept on adding something here and there and everywhere else, then taking this away and crossing that out, deleting this, amending that. And ultimately, we have what was once described to me as an old rickety house, and we just keep on papering over the cracks, but ultimately the walls inside are still cracked. And I think it's about time that the house got demolished and a complete root and branch review of all the regulations be undertaken. But enough of a rant here, Michael. It's early Monday morning. We should be celebrating Max Verstappen, so let's carry on with that.
Well, just another quick word on the regulations, because there was that 5-second penalty that was given to Charles Leclerc after the very last lap, when he was trying his best to keep Sergio Perez behind him. He went straight on at the chicane, and then he was adjudged to have maybe moved over on Perez. The stewards issued him with a 5-second penalty. That dropped him from second to third, and that was the significant move that meant that no driver could therefore overtake Max Verstappen's total, and that confirmed Verstappen
Correct.
as the world champion. Did Leclerc deserve that 5-second penalty? I mean, I suppose the one good thing you could say is that it was decided fairly quickly, and we all knew very quickly what the result was and how it affected things.
Well, I don't believe there was any doubt about that. In fact, Charles himself said that he thought it was a fair penalty. He said, I made a mistake. Yes, that's it. And let's not forget, it's very easy to say, oh, well, poor Charles. But equally, had it gone the other way, poor Checo, because he'd done everything right to that point. He'd put the pressure on Charles. He'd pushed him and pushed him and pushed him under very tricky conditions until eventually his prey actually committed an error. Now, I believe that Mattia Bonotto on Italian television was rather upset and forthright, understandably, but equally, when the driver himself, the one who actually lost all chance of the championship in the process, says that he thought it was a fair penalty, I think that sort of vindicates the decision. In terms of speed, last week in Singapore, we all complained it took so long to sort out the Checo Perez inquiry investigation. And this time, when they do one quickly, it was done too quickly. Obviously, it wasn't thought through. So again, the FIA is damned if they do and is damned if they don't. And really, that is not a very, very comfortable situation for the FIA to be perceived in. And I think that ultimately, collectively, the sport does need to sit back before they start throwing stones, particularly at the governing body on a regular basis.
Well, let's move on now and talk about a particularly concerning image towards the beginning of the race. The reason that it was stopped after just a couple of laps was in part because Carlos Sainz had a moment. He lost control of his car. He ended up in the barriers and then with his car on the road. And then there was a recovery vehicle on the track to remove that stricken Ferrari. Now, Pierre Gasly, who had actually hit an advertising hoarding that had been brought onto the track when Sainz's stricken Ferrari fell back onto the track, he'd collected that hoarding and he had to come back to the pits to have that removed and take on new tyres. So when the safety car came out to neutralise the race, Gasly was a long way behind, going at a quicker pace than the cars behind the safety car because he was trying to catch up to them, which is what the drivers are told that they're supposed to do. And then, so he was going at fairly substantial speed whilst that tractor, that recovery vehicle, was on the track trying to clear Sainz's stricken Ferrari, which was a very concerning image. Gasly himself was very distressed about it afterwards. You could see how angry he was. He expressed his anger very, very clearly in the interviews post-race. And it brings back those awful scenes at Suzuka in very similar conditions in 2014 when poor Jules Bianchi hit that tractor and sustained massive head injuries from which he eventually lost his life a year later. But very, very concerning scenes, Dieter. How and why did this situation happen? How did we get a recovery vehicle and a marshal, actually, on track while Pierre Gasly was going at substantial speed past them?
Yes, Michael, that should not have happened. And I think the investigation will show exactly how that happened. Ultimately, and I think this is, again, one of the complexities of Formula One, is that although the race is actually under the control of the race director, it is actually the clerk of course who gives the messages to the marshal posts, who in turn give them to the the other marshals at those posts. So I think we'd have to look at the entire chain of command. But yes, absolutely, this should not have happened, particularly given 2014, Jules Bianchi at that circuit, very similar conditions, etc., etc. And in fact, one of the poignant messages on social media yesterday was Felipe Bianchi saying, 8 years on, have they not learned a lesson? Felipe Bianchi, of course, being the father of Jules. So Felipe said this on Facebook, and I thought this is, there is a ring of truth to this, and it is, in fact, very concerning. That said, we should not overlook that Pierre Gasly was actually speeding. He knew there was an accident. He picked up the advertising hoarding. He knew there was an accident. He should have known that there was going to have to be some kind of recovery process, etc. And, I think that a lot of the reaction yesterday, of course, there was shock and horror on his part, seeing this tractor, but equally, he'd had a very frustrating weekend all the way through. And I think that we could ultimately see in his face the frustration of the whole weekend. He'd had brake problems in qualifying. He had all sorts of things. He had to start from the back of the grid, etc. And I think that he just saw this as a culmination of a terrible weekend for himself, notwithstanding the fact, of course, that he'd been announced the previous day as the Alpine driver for next year. So all in, it should not have happened. Yes, absolutely not. Equally, Pierre, I do believe, did not drive with all due care, which I believe in the Stewart's inquiry, he actually admitted afterwards. So I think, again, there are always two sides to every story.
Yeah, he took a time penalty for speeding too quickly, but the specific moment of where he was adjudged to have been going too quickly was turns 14 and 15 further around the lap. So the section of the track where he passed the recovery vehicle was not taken into consideration when they were giving him the penalty. If the safety car was out at the time, but Gasly was going quicker than the train of cars to try to catch up to them, which the drivers are supposed to do. So if you have a car in that situation trying to catch up to the back of the pack, is the race therefore neutralized enough to warrant bringing out a recovery vehicle? And there was also the marshal on track as well, around the front of Sainz's car.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. As I said, none of this should have happened. And I do believe that the investigation will show what did go wrong. And I think that we should await the results of that. But I do stress that this in no way mitigates the fact that there should not have been a recovery vehicle on track. Full stop.
Well, the race was suspended after those 2 laps, and we waited about 2 more hours before we finally got started again. We did get those 40 minutes of racing in, which was a lot more than some in the paddock thought we were going to get. I remember seeing Andreas Seidel being interviewed, and he was very skeptical that we'd actually get going at all. So to get 40 minutes of racing and 28 laps of racing was certainly better than it might have been. It was decreed that it was going to be a rolling start with full wet tyres on. The cars, the drivers were obliged to take on full wet tyres. But after 1 or 2 laps, almost everyone changed from those wet tyres onto intermediate tyres. So could we have gone racing a little bit sooner than we did? It seemed like the visibility was very bad, but actually the track conditions were obviously fine enough for the drivers to discard those wet tyres and go on to inters after just a lap or 2.
Correct. And, obviously the visibility for the front man is no problem whatsoever, but it's all the other guys behind him. And this, of course, is where you have the risk of accidents, etc. I think that here we need to consider 2 points, and that is that the cars, the 2022 cars, react completely differently to wet conditions to what their predecessors did. The reason for this is that we have ground effects. In other words, they create the ground effect through suction below the car, through a Venturi effect. The air passing below the car sucks it to the ground, forces that air out effectively, which is what creates that suction and creates a vacuum below the car. What we now have is, where last year where we had a top-down aero setup where the air flowing over the car pushed it down, it is now the air flowing underneath the car that sucks it down. And of course, in the process of dispersing this air, it disperses all the water as well and throws it straight back at the guy behind. In fact, last year after Spa, I actually highlighted this when everybody was going through the visibility issue. At the time, I said to some engineers, is this not going to be worse next year? And he said, yes, actually, yes, it could be. And of course, I believe that that's now been proven correct. It is worse than last year. The other thing, of course, is the fact that we also have new tyres for this year. And I believe that perversely, the tyres are actually too effective in dispersing water, and what they now do, the water's got to go somewhere. The tyre takes it off the tarmac and throws it somewhere, and of course it throws it right behind itself, behind the car, straight into the path of the following cars. So I think that we now have, with the new aero ground effect cars and the new tyres, we have a situation where visibility is worse than it was before.
Yeah, talking about those wet tyres, it's interesting that we had that rolling restart and all the drivers were mandated to be on the wet tyres. There was no such mandate at the original standing start. And if the drivers had to have had those wet tyres on for the standing start, maybe we wouldn't have had Carlos Sainz going off. We also saw Zhou Guanyu spun and somebody else, I forget who, Sebastian Vettel spun as well. Maybe we wouldn't have had those incidents, and maybe we wouldn't have had to stop the race, and maybe we would have we could have just gone on.
Correct. Look, I mean, tyre choice is obviously free under the conditions, and, so it should be. Let the drivers, let the teams decide how they see the conditions, let them take the risks and the chances, because who knows, it could pay off, starting on inters when everybody else is on wets or vice versa. And this is really what we want to see. But I think here, once again, the crucial point is that the regulations, the way they are written, mandate full wet weather tyres in the event of a rolling start. So there was no option. And again, I think this is a situation that should be looked at. But equally, one must then question why rolling start if it was dry enough for people to start on inters. And again, these are all the factors that I think should be looked at with this root and branch review of the regulations that I spoke about earlier on.
You said that the wet tyres were too good. And it feels like nobody really wants to use them when you have a situation where Sebastian Vettel and Nicholas Latifi, not even after one lap on those wet tyres, went on to the inters, which have a much wider operating window. We've seen in recent races where drivers go on the intermediate tyres, and when the track starts to dry, when you see a dry line emerging, those inters start to become almost like slick tyres, and the drivers can eke out more of the life of that tyre than they can on the wet tyres. So do Pirelli need to change the construction of those wet tyres so that they last longer, or so that they have a wider operating window, or like you just said, so that maybe they don't throw up quite so much in the way of the spray and that affects the visibility of the cars behind?
And if they don't throw up as much of the spray, they're prone to aquaplaning, and then everybody says, let's stop the race because of aquaplaning. And this, again, is one of these conundrums that we constantly face in Formula One. Equally, if we have a look at what Sebastian and Nicholas did yesterday, they took a chance. They didn't know whether it was going to be better, but they basically said, we've got nothing to lose. They were at the tail end of the field. We had the converse with Mick Schumacher, where the team said, let's leave him out there on full wets just in case there's a safety car. So I don't think that I think tactically it was the right decision by Sebastian and Nicholas to change, yes. And tactically it turned out to be the incorrect decision for Mick. But ultimately, this again is part of the ebb and flow of tactics. Teams take chances, they have a look at it, they take the decision based on what they feel, see, perceive, and we just had these two differing options taken up.
Yeah, I mean, Vettel and Latifi, they really, really benefited from that because, well, not only were they on the faster tyre, but then obviously they had, or Vettel, because he got out of the pit lane first, had that clear track ahead of him and was several seconds a lap quicker. Everyone else saw that the writing was on the wall and that was the way to go. And Vettel ended up equaling his best result of the season. Latifi finished 9th for his first points of the season. I also want to talk about Esteban Ocon, because he was well up there in 4th place, fending off Lewis Hamilton. There wasn't much in the way of drama and intrigue right at the front of the field, because Verstappen, as he tends to do, just drove off into the distance. But I was very, very impressed with the way that Esteban Ocon was keeping Hamilton behind him. Hamilton, trying every trick in the book to get past Ocon. but couldn't make it stick. And, of course, valuable points for Alpine in their battle for fourth place in the Constructors. They've now overtaken McLaren again.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back, if I may, to the Sebastian/Nicola situation. Let's not forget that they were at the back of the pack, and therefore they had nothing to lose. And when they pitted, they didn't really lose much track position because they were at the back in any event. I think had Sebastian been running third or fourth, I doubt whether he would have made the same call. And equally on Nicholas's case, I believe that the team bosses have got a sort of internal WhatsApp group, and that Jos Capito, during the red flag period, said, let's stop this race right now. Let's stop the race. It's not going to get any better. We may as well pack up and go home. And, of course, had they heeded his suggestion, he wouldn't have scored those 2 points. So these, again, are some of these sort of ironies of that situation. As far as Esteban is concerned, yes, interestingly, on my flight to the Middle East, I was talking to somebody in the plane, and I said that it was very, very interesting to watch the sort of cat and mouse play between Esteban and Lewis. And I think that Esteban, on his day, is a real fighter who knows exactly how to defend legally, it must be said. But he was sort of blocking Lewis wherever he could. Lewis, I believe, had the slightly quicker car, but just couldn't find a way past.
Yeah, and it seemed to be, once again, it's not the first time this season that we've seen a Mercedes seemingly suffering from a bit of a lack of straight-line speed, because he would close up behind Ocon in the slipstream, and then as soon as he moved out to pass, then the Alpine would just have enough in hand. And it's something that we've seen quite a lot this season, and it's not often in recent years that we've been able to say that a Mercedes has just run out of grunt a little bit.
Correct. Look, first of all, I think that, the word in the paddock is that the Mercedes is no longer the clear winner on power, the engine. In fact, I believe that the Honda is currently the most powerful engine there is out there, followed by the Ferrari, followed by the Mercedes. And then, ironically, in view of our discussion, I believe the Alpine is on about the Renault engine. The Alpine is on about par with the Mercedes. So that could be part of the explanation. But I think the other part is that I think that the Mercedes is a very draggy car, as we call it. Whereby the minute it's out of the slipstream, the drag factor takes over and it just loses that sort of oomph. So I think Mercedes, I'm not sure that they have yet fully discovered the reason for the disappointing performance of the W13 this year, but it's certainly a decision they're going to have to take very, very soon, whether they continue with the current car concept and develop it to its peak, if that's possible, or whether they ditch that zero side pod type concept entirely. But either way, they seem to have a very draggy car.
Well, looking at off-track matters now, we were hoping by the time of the Japanese Grand Prix weekend to have seen the FIA's financial regulations, the result of their findings. There was a lot of chatter leading up to the race that perhaps Red Bull and perhaps Aston Martin had breached the cost cap. As it is, that hasn't come out yet at the time we're recording this podcast. We're expecting that to come out at some point on Monday evening. What are you expecting to see in that release?
This, of course, is being recorded Monday morning, just for the sake of our listeners. What am I expecting to see? I do believe that there will be some form of agreed breach. In other words, what they call an accepted breach agreement, where a team accepts that they were in breach and they then strike some sort of deal with the FIA. Let's not forget, it wasn't that long ago that Ferrari struck a similar deal with the FIA over its engine, where they said, okay, well, we're not going to plead guilty or anything, but we will basically explain to you what we did, and that's the end of that matter. And they sort of had this almost secret agreement. So I think that we may have something like that. I'm not sure exactly how the FIA is going to attack this. We do have a new administration, but if there is an agreement, I personally believe and have thought so throughout the season that any breach will actually be a matter of interpretation. We're coming back to the old regulatory situation. Will in fact be a matter of interpretation rather than downright cheating, where somebody said, "Oh, well, forget the budget cap. We're just going to spend X, Y, Z on it." So I think that it's a matter of interpretation. Somebody may have been found in breach, but I believe that could be an explainable breach, and therefore there'll be the sort of agreement that's reached, and basically they'll be told to behave themselves going forward, a sort of a rap over the knuckles. And if there is a penalty, I believe the penalty will be a deduction of that amount of money off this year's budget cap. So if somebody is in breach of, let's say, 3 million, then what they'll be told is, okay, you interpreted it incorrectly, but for 2022, let's not forget, these numbers we're talking about, these breaches, are the 2021 operating season. So what they'll then be told is we'll deduct that overspend from this year, because a lot of this year's car development was, of course, paid for last year. So that will affect that team this year and going forward with its development for next year as well. That's what I expect, but who knows? One can never second guess the FIA when it comes to these matters.
Well, we're just about running out of time now, but in a couple of weeks' time, we've got the United States Grand Prix in Austin. Red Bull can win the Constructors' Championship at that circuit. Max Verstappen won that race last year. What are you expecting to happen in this year's race, Dieter?
Well, first of all, it's a completely different circuit to what we had in Japan, and equally what we had in Singapore, and for that matter, also completely different to Monza before that. So very, very difficult to make predictions here 2 weeks in advance. However, I think the pointers are that Max will probably pick up his 13th victory. If not, probably Checo will take his third victory of the year. And I do believe that Red Bull stand every chance of taking the Constructors' Championship in America, which again I think will do wonders for the marketing of their drinks product. But equally, let's hope that Ferrari can somehow come back and take a real fight to them. I think that the closing races of the season, we do need that to keep the action going all the way through, to keep the interest going. I, for a long time, believe that there is too much emphasis placed on the championship and not enough on individual races. When I say that, we watch Wimbledon. We don't watch Wimbledon to see who's going to be ranked number one or whether he stays number one. We watch it for the spectacle. The same with any of the major golf tournaments, etc. And I do believe that there is too much emphasis on the World Championship and there's not enough on the individual races. And really, that's what we should be focusing on from here on into the end of the year. The individual races, let's hope that every one of them is worthy of a World Championship round.
And of course, we've got 4 more races this year. If Max Verstappen wins 2 of them, he is going to break the record for the most amount of Grand Prix wins by one driver in a single season. Is he going to do it?
Well, I think the chances are that, he's got to win 50% of the remaining 4 to do that. 1 win to add to his 12 would equal the record. 2 would, of course, break the record, as you correctly say, Michael. So can he win 50% of the remaining 4 races? Yes, absolutely he can, particularly if we have a look at their nature. We have Austin, he's always performed very well. Mexico, he thrives in, plus, of course, the high altitude with the Honda engine performance advantage. Then, of course, in Brazil, he's always been very, very good. And that leaves Abu Dhabi, where again, we can't base it on last year's form, of course, but equally, I do believe that he's got what he needs to win at least 2 of the 4 remaining races, maybe even 3 or all 4 of them. Absolutely. But please allow me to add that these sort of records, most wins in a race, in a season, are to me meaningless, because somebody like Jim Clark, who contested only 10 races in 1963, could never win 13 or 14 races. It's that simple. So, equally the most points and the most this and the most the other, the most race starts, Fernando Alonso the other day with 350. Absolutely meaningless statistics. All they do actually prove is the longevity of a driver's career, and that thankfully, is predominantly due to the safety advances that were made. But for the rest, these numbers don't mean anything to me.
And of course, we've got the most races in a season that we've ever had, so it's easier for Verstappen to win 14
Absolutely.
races than it was, say, Nigel Mansell in 1992.
When there were 16, and equally, if we go and have a look at Fernando Alonso's career achievement, 350 starts, a fantastic number, absolutely, and I take my hat off to him. And I'm certainly not in any way trying to belittle that achievement, but if we have a look at, if you have 20 odd races in a year, it's a 17 season period required. When Jim Clark had 10 races in a year, he would have had to race for 35 years under incredibly dangerous conditions to try and get to 350, and that's why these numbers are just meaningless to me.
Yeah, well, he raced a lot of races every year, but only a few of them counted towards the championship in those days.
Correct, and this again is the point. So, Michael, yes, we had Cedric Seltzer on our podcast a couple of months back, and of course, Cedric was the chief mechanic stroke chief engineer or race engineer to Jim Clark in '63 when they won the championship. And Cedric was telling me that at one stage they did something like 34 races in a season, 34 Formula One races in a season. But of course, 10 of those counted towards the championship. The others were non-championship events. So times really have changed.
Well, we're just about out of time now for the podcast, but Dieter, thank you very much for joining me again, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again after the race in Austin.
Absolutely. Look forward to the trip to America. Always great to be there. Thank you, and thanks for listening.